Hi there. Welcome back to Haunting Veils. Today, we're going to talk about The Dagger in the Mirror, a Hercule Poirot mystery. It's a story filled with shadows, secrets, and reflections that don't always match what's real. What begins as a tragic onstage murder unravels into something far more chilling. So stay with us till the end, because some mirrors don't just reflect, they remember. Chapter 1. The opera's final bow. The Grand Théâtre de Paris was alive with brilliance, its domed ceiling painted with gods, and muses seemingly brought to life by the flickering of candlelight from towering sconces and the slow shimmer of the colossal chandelier above. Every seat in the house was filled, the plush red velvet cushions pressing against the backs of nobility, diplomats, aristocrats, and the season's most talked-about socialites. Murmurs fluttered beneath the gilded arches and frescoed ceilings. Like caged birds, elegant and hushed, rippling through the audience with restrained impatience. Every whisper, every flutter of a fan, every tap of a cane seemed to echo the same question. Would Celestine DuVall be as magnificent as she once was? Or had time claimed her as it did so many others who dared to challenge immortality with art? Hercule Poirot sat in a mezzanine box upholstered in dark walnut and deep gold brocade, his posture immaculate, hands resting lightly on his lap. He was not there for music, though he appreciated it, nor for spectacle, nor society. He was there, by invitation, a courtesy extended by the theater's director, Armand Dupré, a nervous and ambitious man who had practically begged for Poirot's presence. A publicity stunt, Poirot suspected. Having the famous detective in attendance was no doubt meant to impress patrons and lend a certain mystique to the event. Yet, Poirot never arrived anywhere without reason. He had sensed something from the moment the note arrived, an odd phrasing, a hurried tone. And now, seated above the audience, eyes flickering not toward the stage but to the shadows at its edges, he felt it again. That prickling sensation at the nape of the neck. Attention behind the beauty. On stage, the performance had reached its third act. Celestine DuVall, cloaked in a sweeping white gown that pooled like smoke at her feet, stood illuminated at center stage. Her voice carried like an incantation, flawless in its tone, trembling with raw emotion. Even those who had doubted her return, who whispered that her voice had aged, that she had lost her discipline, now sat breathless. Her hands shook slightly, but whether from passion or something deeper, Poirot could not yet say. She seemed haunted, yes, but not merely by the role. Backstage, the movements were quick and practiced. A flurry of assistants, understudies, prop masters. Yet amidst the efficiency, Poirot's gaze caught something unusual, a figure cloaked in black slipping through the rear curtain, moving in the opposite direction of the flow. Too swift, too calm, and gone before anyone else noticed. The aria reached its crescendo. Celestine's eyes, brilliant, sharp, almost feverish, flashed toward the wings as she sang. There was something beneath her voice now, not just the despair of Lucia, the character, but the fear of Celestine, the woman. Poirot leaned slightly forward, his fingers steepling. Then came the final bow. The audience rose in applause as the curtain fell, the theater rumbling with bravos, flowers tossed in arcs of color from the balconies. Cast members took their bows. Celestine emerged last, pale and perfect, a bloodstained prop knife tied at her waist, her hands lifted in modest triumph. She did not smile. She blinked at the lights as if unsure where she stood. And then, she was gone. The curtain fell once more. The applause dimmed. The lights began to rise. Behind that curtain, death had already arrived at a tea first. No one noticed. The cast members returned to their dressing rooms in fits of laughter, exchanging hurried compliments and critiques. Bottles of champagne were passed about, the chorus still half in costume, wigs half removed. Liana Vautrin, the understudy, paced nervously outside Celestine's door, script pages clutched tightly to her chest, her face a mixture of admiration and envy. She knocked once. No answer. Knocked again, more firmly. Still silence. She bit her lip and turned away. It was Madame Broussard, the costume mistress, who sensed something was wrong. Celestine was known to be fastidious in her routine. She removed her makeup within 5 minutes, changed swiftly, and exited the building through the stage-left corridor without lingering. She never missed her rhythm. Never, Celestine Sherry? Madame Broussard called gently, knocking with curled fingers against the oak. You must let me in. I have your coat. Silence. Only the faint buzz of the dressing room lamp seeped through the crack beneath the door. The handle refused to turn. Locked. From the inside, Dupré arrived, flushed and sweating, ordering the doorman to find a spare key. But there wasn't one. Celestine had insisted on a unique lock for her privacy, a lock installed only last month. A star is never off stage, she'd said with a weary smile. Even in her own mirror, she is performing. It was Dupré himself who finally shouldered the door open with a grunt and a crack of splintering wood. The room beyond was silent. Frozen, Celestine DuVall sat before her shattered vanity mirror, still dressed in her stage gown, her eyes wide, open and locked upon her reflection, or what remained of it. A dagger protruded cleanly from her sternum, blood soaking the lace of her bodice in a slow, grotesque bloom. The handle of the dagger was unmistakable. It was from the prop collection. Yet this one glinted not with theatrical dullness, but with deadly sheen. At her feet, shards of glass glimmered underfoot, and across the largest pane of the mirror, smeared in crimson lipstick, was a single word written with a trembling hand: Reflet. The chaos that followed felt muted, as though the theater itself held its breath. Liana's scream echoed down the corridor. The head stagehand backed into a wall and muttered a prayer. Someone dropped a tray of glasses. The crash seemed far too loud. And Dupré, white-faced and shaking, did the only thing he could think of. He sent for Hercule Poirot. It'd be why the time Poirot stepped into the dressing room. The edges of panic had sharpened into stillness. The crowd behind him buzzed with theories. Some frantic, some sensational. Poirot ignored them all. He did not speak. He merely studied. The room was undisturbed, save for the destruction focused entirely around the mirror. No signs of struggle. No signs of forced entry. The lock had held. Yet she was dead, and the murder weapon was not only specific, it was theatrical. Poirot moved closer, stepping carefully among the shards. The mirror had not cracked from age or heat. It had been broken deliberately, and recently. Lipstick, Celestine's shade, still clung to the sink. The powder on the vanity had been scattered in haste. One drawer was half open, revealing a handwritten letter tucked among pressed flowers. Her comb lay beneath the stool, snapped in two. The faint perfume of violets clung to the air like a ghost refusing to depart, and that word, Reflet, reflection. Poirot did not look at the word long. He stared instead at the empty corners of the mirror, the angles one never noticed until the center was gone. Something about the arrangement of the glass. Something that spoke not of chaos, but of intention. He turned slowly, surveying the faces outside the room. Actors and stagehands, managers and musicians. Some clutched each other in confusion. Others stood apart, suspiciously silent. One man held his hat tightly in both hands, unmoving. Another dabbed at his eyes, though no tears came. Poirot saw all of them. But more importantly, he saw their reflections. And in that moment, beneath the fractured starlight of a shattered mirror, Hercule Poirot understood that this murder was not born in rage or impulse. It had been rehearsed, costumed, lit with care, as precise as the notes of a soprano's aria. Chapter 2. Masks without faces. The heartbeat of the Grand Théâtre de Paris had changed. Where once it had throbbed with music, applause, and the frenzied but joyful rhythm of performance, it now beat irregularly, hesitant, uncertain, and touched by dread. The ornate corridors that wound like veins through the backstage of the historic building were unnaturally silent, broken only by the occasional creak of old wood or the distant clink of something dropped by a trembling hand. And yet, beneath that silence, Poirot could feel the noise. It was not audible, but it was there. Panic buried beneath restraint. Shock polished into poise. Guilt, perhaps, worn like an accidental costume. It hummed through the ensemble cast of grief-stricken players now seated in the cramped green room and side lounges. He observed them all as he entered. Their faces were lined with fatigue or panic or masked with performative sorrow. The chorus girls sat in a tight cluster, their stage makeup smudged but not fully removed. One dabbed at her cheek with a silk handkerchief embroidered with someone else's initials. Another twisted a bracelet around her wrist so hard Poirot feared she might break it. Hercule Poirot did not speak immediately. He moved through them, quiet and composed, like a conductor assessing his orchestra before lifting his baton. But in his mind, the music was already playing, and the dissonant notes were revealing themselves that he stood at the center of the room. The constables had done well to clear the hallways, keeping the suspects here, not as prisoners, but as potential witnesses. Tonight, Poirot began. The theater has suffered a great tragedy. A woman is dead. A woman beloved by many, resented by others, envied by a few, and known by all. I ask you now not for your mourning, but for your attention. I am not the police. I am not the audience. I am merely the man who listens, truly listens, to the whispers beneath your silence. They watched him, some with respect, some with subtle defiance, some with open fear. He turned his attention first to the young woman seated apart from the others, the understudy, Liana Vautrin. Her posture was tense, arms folded tightly over her stomach as though trying to hold something broken inside her. "Tell me," Poirot said, his voice soft, "how long have you understudied for Mademoiselle DuVall?" Liana looked up with wide eyes. 3 months. I joined the company in March. This was to be my first season. And in that time, how would you describe your relationship with her? Liana hesitated. Respectful, but distant. She did not care for understudies. She told me once, shadows should know their place. A few heads turned at that. Someone stifled a gasp. She was hard to please, Liana added quickly. But brilliant. She didn't teach, she tested. Poirot watched her carefully. And tonight? Did anything strike you as unusual about her behavior? She was anxious. She kept checking her makeup in the mirror, but it wasn't vanity. It was almost obsession. She touched her face like she didn't trust what it showed her. At one point, I caught her whispering something under her breath. I asked if she needed anything. She just shook her head and said, "The mirror is lying to me." "The mirror," Poirot echoed. Did she say anything else? She asked me if I'd ever seen my reflection move before I did. I didn't know what to say. I thought she was rehearsing a line. Poirot paused. No, she was not. He moved next to a tall, thin man with silver-threaded hair and a stoic face. Jules Renard, first-chair violinist. Jules met Poirot's gaze steadily, but his hands betrayed him. He kept rubbing his thumb along the edge of his case, over and over, like a prayer. "You've worked with her before," Poirot said. "Many times, I believe. More than I can count. She preferred to perform with musicians she trusted. I suppose I passed the test. And this evening, she was magnificent. Her voice was flawless. But I noticed something strange. Right before the final aria, she looked toward stage left. She was supposed to look at the conductor, but she didn't. Her eyes moved to the wing, and she froze. Just for a moment, like she saw something or someone. You saw nothing? No. But she faltered on a note. That never happened before. Not to her." Poirot nodded, then turned to Madame Broussard, the costume mistress. She had not moved since he'd entered. Her heavy arms crossed over her chest, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. "Madam," he said gently, "you oversaw the props and wardrobe?" "I did." Every stitch and every strap. And the dagger? Her jaw clenched. It was not ours. The original prop dagger was locked in the second cabinet in the prop room. I checked it myself. Someone replaced it with a real one. Same style, same handle, but it was steel, balanced, lethal. Who else had a key to the cabinet? Only Georges Bellamy, the prop master. But he left after Act 2. His wife called for him. He's been here 20 years, never a problem. I would like to speak with him, Poirot said. Have him return as soon as possible. He will. He's loyal. He adored Celestine. Poirot walked slowly to a side table where half-filled glasses of champagne sat untouched. He picked up one, examined the lipstick smudge, slightly smeared. Not Celestine's color. He noted it and set it aside to at last. He returned to the dressing room. The body had been removed, but the room remained untouched beyond the work of the constables, measured photographs, string markers, detailed notations. On yellowed paper that he approached the mirror, still shattered, still commanding. He leaned in closer than before, examining the cracks. But then something caught his eye. Beneath the vanity, a fragment, he retrieved it carefully with his glove. It was not from the large mirror. It was smaller, compact, perhaps the lid of a hand mirror or a powder case. On its back, beneath the film of dust, was the unmistakable smudge of a fingerprint, larger than Celestine's, broader, masculine. But even more disturbing was what was etched faintly into the silver rim. A mark, not a manufacturer's signature, but a tiny hand-carved symbol. A spiral. Poirot stared at it for several seconds. Then stood. He stepped out once again into the hallway where the others waited. The mirror, he said softly, was not merely a mirror. It was a stage of its own, a silent witness. And someone used it, not as reflection, but as entrance. A stunned silence followed. He turned toward Dupré. Find me the name of the antique dealer who sold her the mirror. And find me Georges Bellamy. The theater director nodded and hurried off. Poirot walked slowly back through the hallway, pausing by the spot where Celestine had taken her final bow. The chalk outline of where she had died backstage was nearly scrubbed now, but Poirot could still feel it beneath his feet, the invisible echo of death that a star had fallen. But it had not been fate, nor madness, nor a random act. It had been written, rehearsed, directed, and like every tragedy, it had a hidden author. He just had to read the script. Chapter 3. The Man in the Mirror. The next morning broke gray and cold. An overcast veil hung low over Paris like a curtain refusing to rise. The Grand Théâtre de Paris stood silent, its opulence muted beneath the weight of grief. The posters of Lucia de Lammermoor remained plastered on street corners, but now they seemed ghostly, portraits of a show forever paused in its final bow. Inside the theater, everything remained frozen, as if the building itself had drawn in its breath and refused to let go. Poirot arrived at 8 o'clock sharp, stepping into the manager's office where Dupré waited with 2 steaming cups of black coffee and a stack of files taller than the schedule board backstage. She bought the mirror 3 weeks ago, Dupré said without preamble, pushing the invoice forward. From a dealer in Montmartre named Etienne Leclerc, an antique restorer. I had the mirror brought in by private courier. Celestine refused to let our crew handle it. She had it installed herself. Poirot picked up the thin receipt, turning it over in his hands. A handwritten note was scrawled at the bottom in thick black ink. A gift returned. Best kept covered. He stared at the sentence for a moment too long. It was not a typical merchant's flourish. It was a warning, or perhaps a regret. Where is this Monsieur Leclerc? Poirot asked. Dupré checked his notes. Rue de Trois Frères. Lives above his shop. Shall I call ahead? No, Poirot said quietly. I think he would speak more freely without rehearsal. An hour later, Poirot stepped into a narrow, crumbling alley lined with shuttered ateliers and second-hand bookstores. The sign above a heavy wooden door read Leclerc and Phil's, Objets Anciens et Curieux. The windows were yellowed with time. A bell tinkled as Poirot entered, and the scent of varnish, dust, and old paper greeted him like an old friend. The shop was crammed wall to wall with forgotten lives, carved angels with cracked wings, portraits with eyes that followed you, iron keys with unknown locks. But it was the mirrors that caught Poirot's attention. Mirrors of every shape and size. Some draped with cloth, others tilted toward the wall, none pointed outward, none facing the center of the room. A man emerged from the back, a tall, wiry figure in his 60s, with silver hair pulled into a loose knot and spectacles that dangled around his neck. "I am Leclerc," he said before Poirot could speak. "You are not here to buy." "No," Poirot replied. "I am here about a mirror. The one you sold to Mademoiselle Celestine DuVall." Leclerc's face changed instantly. The calm of a merchant faded, and something darker, older, rose behind. His eyes. "She is dead." "Yes." "She did not cover the glass, did she?" Poirot's brows lifted slightly. "Cover it?" "No. Why would she?" Leclerc sighed, moving past Poirot to a shelf where he lifted a dusty cloth and draped it across a round mirror with a golden frame. "She came here insisting on a particular design. Beveled glass, carved backing, silvered edge. But more than that, she was searching for a reflection she'd seen before. A frame from her childhood. She said her grandmother owned one just like it." "Did she tell you why?" Leclerc looked down. "She said the mirror remembered her." Poirot said nothing. The silence stretched until Leclerc continued. "I tried to refuse. That piece, it had come back to me after decades. I restored it once, long ago, after a fire. It came from an estate in Lyon, where a woman took her own life in front of it. She had claimed, in her final letter, that the mirror showed her someone watching. When her husband tried to remove it, he claimed the reflection did not match the room, that the figure in the glass stood a little too still." Leclerc's voice had lowered. "You see why I didn't want to sell it." But Celestine insisted. "She paid double. I warned her." She smiled and said, "If something sees me, perhaps I will see it too." Poirot's mind spun silently. He folded the note and placed it back into his coat. "Merci, Monsieur Leclerc. You've been most helpful." As he left, he noticed something he hadn't before. On the wall behind the counter, covered in shadow, hung a fractured triptych mirror. 3 panels. Only the center was uncovered. And though Poirot stood alone in the shop, he could have sworn, for the briefest moment, a second silhouette stood beside his reflection. Back at the theater, Georges Bellamy had arrived. The prop master was in his late 50s, with thinning hair and a stiff leg wrapped in a medical brace. His hands were large, rough from years of building illusions, swords that bent, chairs that collapsed, coins that vanished. He sat in the green room nervously, sipping lukewarm tea. "I didn't touch the dagger," he insisted. "The real one. I would never bring a real weapon on stage." The cabinet was locked. "Madame Broussard and I are the only ones with keys. And mine hasn't left my pocket." Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet it was replaced. Bellamy rubbed his face with both hands. Someone had a replica made. A real blade in the exact style. They must have switched it during the final act. Or before. Bellamy hesitated. During dress rehearsal, Celestine insisted the dagger remain with her in her room. She said she wanted to channel its weight to improve her performance. She gave it back after the scene, but it wasn't the same dagger. "You're certain?" "Yes." The handle had a dent. The original didn't. Poirot scribbled a note. "You told no one?" Bellamy flushed. "I told Broussard. She said not to worry, that Celestine knew what she was doing. But I was uneasy, so I made sure to retrieve the dagger after every scene. At least I thought I did." Poirot stood slowly, turning to leave. "Tell me, Georges, have you ever looked into a mirror and seen something you cannot explain?" The man paused. "Only once. In Celestine's dressing room. 2 nights ago. She asked me to help adjust a light. I glanced up at the mirror, And I swear, for just a second, I saw her reflection blink before she did. Poirot left the room without another word. Upstairs, he returned to the dressing room. The mirror remained shattered, but its frame had not been removed. He stood before it once again. The cracks radiated like a spider's web. The word Reflet had dulled slightly in the cold daylight. He pulled the small mirror fragment from his pocket, the one with the fingerprint and the spiral. He turned it slowly in his gloved hand. What had Celestine seen in that mirror? What had haunted her so terribly that even her death felt staged symbolic? He stepped back. The angle of the room caught his eye. The mirror, when unbroken, would have reflected the hallway behind the door, only visible when it was cracked open slightly. The murderer, then, might have been watched from within the room, through the mirror, and maybe, they knew it. He turned sharply. For the first time in this case, Poirot felt something rare, not suspicion, not logic, but a flicker of unease. There was more to this mirror than memory. Something about it was not merely the object of obsession. It had become a portal for fear, for rage, for death, and somewhere, someone knew exactly what it had revealed. Chapter 4. A voice from the frame. Evening had fallen over Paris with the slow deliberateness of a stage curtain drifting to the floor. Street lamps flickered to life one by one like footlights before a performance. The world outside the Grand Theatre de Paris moved at its usual pace. Buses rolled along slick cobblestones. Umbrellas bloomed like flowers in the drizzle, and lovers argued gently in shadowed doorways. But inside the theater, time itself had changed. The building felt different. Now, not merely quieter, not just heavy with death. It felt watched, as if something unseen had stepped forward from behind the scenery and taken a seat in the audience, waiting patiently for its next act to begin. Hercule Poirot walked the halls not like a visitor, nor an investigator, but like a man who had wandered into a dream and could not find the exit. He passed locked doors that seemed to breathe. Mirrors turned to face the wall. Costumes still hung in half-shadowed alcoves, their sequins catching the light like waiting eyes. He returned once again to Celestine DuVall's dressing room. The scent of expensive perfume still clung faintly to the curtains. The mirror was now more broken than before, splintered by the constables when they'd tried to remove evidence behind the frame. Its fractures had multiplied, carving new fault lines across the surface. The word Reflet, once sharp in red lipstick, had begun to fade, not erased, but bleeding into the cracks, as if even the glass wanted to swallow the message back into itself. Poirot sat at the edge of her vanity chair, brushing dust from the surface with a handkerchief as he laid out the contents of a small, linen-bound letter bundle discovered inside the vanity's secret drawer. One, even the constables had missed. The drawer had stuck, too tightly wedged in its frame, and Poirot's fingers had found the tiny pressure catch that popped it open with a faint click. Inside, he had found secrets, letters tied with crimson ribbon, pale blue envelopes aged to ivory. The faint scent of lavender still lingered. The penmanship, elegant, slanted, unmistakably feminine, was signed only with a single initial. He began to read. "You remember the room, don't you? The third floor in grandmother's house. The one we were forbidden to enter after dusk. But you went in anyway. We both did. The mirror was already there, wrapped in black cloth. But you took it off. You said you weren't afraid, that it was just glass. But I saw it then, Celestine. I saw it blink. I saw it smile. It wasn't ours." Poirot set the letter down and picked up another. "You said it was a dream, that I was imagining it. But you looked too long. You kept looking. You asked me if my reflection ever moved after I walked away. You laughed when you said it, but I knew you meant it. And that's when it started. The cold behind the curtain. The humming. The voice that sounded like mine, but wasn't. We let it in. You know we did. Another. They think I left because of the scandal. They think I ran away. But you know the truth. It followed me to Vienna. It stood behind me in every reflection. I covered all the mirrors, but it still came. It doesn't need glass. It needs attention. That's why I never performed again, because I was never alone on stage. Poirot folded the letters with careful reverence, sliding them back into their envelope. The weight of them, the confession, the memories, felt heavier than the wood and glass of the room itself. He stood slowly and approached the mirror once more. The cracks had deepened overnight. One sliver had shifted slightly from the pressure of gravity, or perhaps from something else. Something breathing beneath the silver backing. Poirot touched the frame with a gloved hand. The bevel was chipped, the ornate carving still cold. But when he tilted his head slightly, just enough to catch the corner of the mirror's reflection, he saw it, for only a second too long. A figure, tall, motionless, pale, standing just behind him. That he turned immediately. The room was empty. No footsteps, no shadows, no breathing. He turned back toward the mirror and whispered to himself, "Non, not a trick of light. Not this time." The mind of Hercule Poirot was one of logic, pattern, deduction. He did not chase ghosts, but he respected theater. And he knew theater when he saw it. Someone had staged this reflection. Someone had planned this appearance. Someone had become the reflection. But who? Later that night, Poirot found himself in the Grand Theatre's administrative archive, a cold, dim space below the stage filled with ledgers, show posters, payroll slips, and the brittle ghosts of programs from half-forgotten operas. Dupré had reluctantly allowed him access, muttering something about wasting time among dead paperwork. But Poirot knew better. Among paper, secrets lived longer than flesh. He spent over an hour combing through performance records, tax ledgers, old cast lists. And then, there it was, Arianne DuVall, listed as mezzo-soprano, debuted in 1905, 3 years before her younger sister Celestine, starred in La Favorita, Carmen, Orphée et Eurydice. Reviews praised her haunting stage presence and uncanny ability to mesmerize the audience with stillness. But something changed. After 1910, her name vanished. There were no exit records, no retirement announcement, no death notice, just a sudden cessation, as though the ink had run dry on her existence. Poirot leaned back in the stiff chair. The dates matched the letter. Arianne hadn't just vanished from public life. She had been written out, deliberately. And yet, she had returned. Not in flesh, perhaps, but in letters, in memory, in glass. That he stood and made his way to the north wing, toward the understudy's quarters. Something gnawed at him, a thread he hadn't pulled yet. He approached Liana Vautrin's dressing room, paused at the door, and knocked softly. No answered. He opened it slowly. The room was empty. Not tidy, empty. Her chair pushed back. Her shawl hung over the door. A single ballet flat lay beside the vanity. The window had been opened, letting in a breath of cold air, the curtains swaying gently as if stirred by a sigh. Poirot's gaze dropped to the mirror on it. 5 deep scratches had been dragged down the glass, as if fingers, frantic or resisting, had clawed at it. Below the mirror, a drop of blood. Not much, just enough to whisper of something wrong. And then he saw it, that a slip of paper, crumpled, caught behind a fallen book beneath the vanity. That he retrieved it and unfolded it slowly. That it was a note, hastily scrawled. "She's here. She speaks when I'm alone. She told me her name was Arianne. She said Celestine opened the door, that the mirror was never meant for one. I tried not to listen, but her voice is mine now. I'm going to her." No signature. Poirot turned his eyes to the windowed, no ladder. No marks. Just the quiet hum of rain and a small smear of blood on the sill. She hadn't run. She had been taken, not with force, not by threat, but by invitation. By a voice, one soft enough to be trusted and familiar enough to obey. Poirot stood motionless in the room for a long time. Then, in the mirror, he saw movement again, not from behind him, but from within. A shift in the darkness of the hallway reflected behind him, though the hallway was, to his eye, still that he stepped closer. The cracks widened, the temperature dropped, and for a moment, just long enough to make his skin crawl, he thought he heard singing, soft, sweet, just beneath the edge of hearing, and just slightly out of sync with its echo. Asterisk. Chapter 5. The other side of the glass morning came in reluctant shades of gray. The fog that had rolled in during the night had not lifted. It lingered over the city like a held breath. And deep within the echoing stone ribs of the Grand Theatre, the chill remained, unbroken, unmoving, a silence too absolute to be natural. Hercule Poirot had slept little. His dreams had been filled with glass, not just broken mirrors, but endless corridors lined with them, some catching his reflection, some not at all. In one, he had looked in and seen not himself, but a woman seated at a vanity, brushing her hair and humming a soft aria in a language he didn't know. When he knocked on the glass, she paused, turned, and smiled. Not cruelly, not warmly, just knowingly. He awoke before dawn and made arrangements. By 10 o'clock, he was standing at the gates of a crumbling chateau on the outskirts of Paris, a place that hadn't seen proper care in decades. Ivy had overrun the outer walls. The iron gate hung crooked on its hinges. The name on the plaque, dulled by years of wind and neglect, read, Maison DuVall, the family estate, long abandoned. The place where Celestine and Arianne had grown up. The place where the mirror had first been found, wrapped in cloth in a forbidden third-floor room. Poirot had convinced Dupré to retrieve the keys from the city's preservation office. Historical family property, he'd claimed. The investigation requires context. No one had objected. No one cared. It was a house that had not welcomed visitors in over 20 years. Inside, the air was stale and dry, coated in a thin veil of dust. Furniture stood beneath sheets. Portraits still hung above fireplaces. Time had paused here, not from reverence, but abandonment. And yet, as Poirot climbed the stairs to the third floor, he felt something different, not just silence. Stillness, not the stillness of absence, but the kind that comes from something watching, listening, waiting. The third floor had only 2 rooms. Point 1 had clearly been a nursery once, long empty, the wallpaper faded to skeletons of its former pattern. The second room, however, was locked. Poirot inserted the key and turned. The lock clicked open with a sound too loud for the quiet it disturbed. Inside, the walls were lined with faded red velvet. The window was covered with blackout curtains, nailed into the frame. And in the center of the room, on a single raised pedestal, stood another mirror, unbroken, identical in frame to the one in Celestine's dressing room, but unmarred, immaculate, and upright. The original. Poirot approached. Slowly. The mirror was covered with a black cloth. Dust lined its hem. He stood before it and took a slow breath. Then he removed the covering and saw himself. Perfectly. Fully. Alone. He studied the reflection for several seconds. The angle of his tie, the line of his mustache, every detail accounted for. Then he took a step to the side, and the reflection did not follow. His heart did not race. Poirot was not a man easily swayed by performance. But this was no illusion of light or trick of delay. His reflection had simply stopped, and now it smiled. Poirot stepped back. He glanced over his shoulder. Nothing behind him. He turned again. To the glass. The reflection was now standing still, upright and unsmiling, mimicking his new pose, but with a delay, as though it were waking up from a sleep it hadn't intended to end. Then, something moved behind it. A figure, small, slight, feminine. He leaned closer. It was Liana, her eyes wide, her mouth moving, but her voice silent, as though behind sound, behind reality. Her reflection pressed its hands against the mirror from the other side. Mon Dieu, Poirot breathed. Then, another figure appeared behind her. Not Liana. Not Arianne, Celestine, but not the Celestine who had died. This one wore no stage makeup. Her hair was looser. Her eyes were darker. Her smile, sad. The two sisters stood side by side behind the glass. One living, one not, or perhaps neither. Poirot did not panic. He did what he always did, that he observed, and that's when he saw the detail. Others would have missed, in Liana's reflection. Her throat bore 5 deep scratches. Fingernail marks. Fresh. But in reality, Liana had not been found. No injury confirmed. The only way her reflection could show that is if she had already been taken. The mirror didn't just reflect. It absorbed, that it watched, that it remembered. And it kept. Poirot returned to the Grand Theatre by midday. He walked with urgency and clarity, not rushed, but purposeful. Dupré was waiting in the manager's office, pale and wide-eyed. "She's still missing," he said. "No one's seen her. No family. No note. Nothing. She's not gone," Poirot said, setting the black cloth on the desk. "She's in the mirror." Dupré blinked. I don't follow." Poirot looked at him calmly. "I do not ask you to believe me. I ask you to listen. The mirror Celestine installed here, identical to the one in her childhood home, was not merely decoration. It was memory. It was obsession. And obsession, monsieur, is contagious." Dupré stood, beginning to pace. "What are you saying? That she's been consumed by her own reflection?" "I am saying," Poirot said, "that Celestine never escaped the moment her sister vanished. She did not fear the mirror. She worshipped it. She believed it saw her, truly, and she needed it to see someone else." "Liana." Dupré froze. "You think she meant for Liana to replace her?" "I think," Poirot said, "Celestine lured her. Or perhaps the mirror did. Does it matter, in the end? The result is the same. Celestine was not killed by a stranger. She was killed by a performance too perfect, one that no longer required her." Dupré sank into his chair. "Then she died willingly?" Poirot paused. "Yes. And no. I believe she orchestrated the act. I believe she wrote the finale. But I do not believe she understood the mirror's cost." "And Liana?" Poirot's eyes narrowed. "I believe she is still alive. Trapped. In the only prison that never ages. Never rusts. Never weakens." He turned to leave. Dupré called after him. "What will you do?" Poirot paused in the doorway. "What I always do," he said. "I solve the mystery." 3 nights later, under the full moon, Poirot returned to the DuVall estate with one final item in hand. A replica mirror, carefully silvered, glass removed. Behind it, a narrow, hidden door, reinforced and locked, with help from the local gendarmerie and a locksmith. He had the mirror frame at the theater removed and examined. Behind it, tucked within a secret compartment, they had found what they feared, that a passage, a viewing space, that a way for someone behind the wall to appear, reflected, but not present, that it had all been theater. But with one exception, Celestine had died. Truly, but Liana had not. They found her, drugged and barely conscious, inside the third-floor room behind the second mirror. The back wall had a two-way glass pane, old, cracked, dusty, and before her stood the mirror. She had been left inside for days. Cold, hungry, but alive. When she was carried out into the gray morning light, she was whispering the same song Celestine had once performed, word for word, note for note. She had not escaped the mirror. She had become it. Poirot returned to his flat that evening and sat in silence before his own looking-glass. The fire flickered behind him. His tea steamed softly. He looked into the mirror, waited, and when nothing stared back but his own tired eyes, he nodded. Some performances, he thought, should never be revived, and some reflections should remain broken.